In an excerpt from his new book, The Greatest Story Ever Sold, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina, Frank Rich of the New York Times writes, quote, 9/11 was a new morning in America, a wake-up call, you'd think, for a country that had been habituated to peace and prosperity and had had the luxury of devoting several years to obsessing about a president's seamy sex life. But whatever else 9/11 was, we can see now that it was the beginning of a new national narrative, a compelling and often persuasive story that was told by the President of the United States and his administration to mobilize a shell-shocked country desperate to be led. Rich states that what the citizens did not know as they rallied behind this president as he went to war was that the administration's highest priority would be not to vanquish al-Qaeda or capture Osama bin Laden, but to consolidate its own power at any cost, a mission that could be accomplished only by a propaganda presidency in which reality was steadily replaced by a scenario of its own invention. In this conversation, Rich illuminates the White House's disturbing love affair with truthiness. Stephen Colbert's word of the night on his first appearance, which was, if you think about it, is amazing that on the first night he comes up with something which has become such a part of American culture. Frank Rich became a New York Times op-ed columnist in 1994 after serving for 13 years as the newspaper's chief drama critic. He's written about culture and politics for many other publications and was on the staffs of Time, the New York Post, and New Times Magazine. After starting his career as a founding editor of the Richmond Mercury, a weekly newspaper in the early 70s, his new book, The Greatest Story Ever Sold, chronicles, as I've said, the rise and fall, hopefully, of the Bush war marketing machine. Welcome, Frank Rich.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let me ask you, I was reminded when I contacted you about being on of the day that I interviewed Paul Krugman.
Right.
And I say this because Paul Krugman, fellow New York Times op-ed writer, the point that I asked in his first question can be similar to what I'm going to ask you. Paul Krugman took over as an op-ed writer at the Times as a moderate economist, a global expert. You remember this. He was the Princeton pointy head. Even the left actually attacked Krugman, that he was too optimistic about free trade and the WTO and so on. And then we watched him morph so that by the time The Great Unraveling came out and I had him on the show, he'd become this fiery critic of the Bush administration, but hardly someone that they could say, well, look at him, he's been a lefty pinko all his life. I bring that up sort of to say, and here you are, drama critic for years, then you become an op-ed writer, and now I would say you also, a fiery critic of the Bush administration.
There's something about the Bush administration that brings out the best or worst in everyone, I guess.
I think you're probably right. But tell us a little bit about that evolution for you.
Absolutely. I've had a very strange career. I grew up in Washington, D.C., in the city itself, in a family that was not involved with politics, which is sort of like, growing up in Beverly Hills with a family that has nothing to do with the show business. And I was always captivated by it. And I was also a stage struck as a kid and interested in theater and culture. And I've always sort of written about both, but I did have a long period when I was a drama critic at the Times, although even then I was writing a bit about politics and culture for the New Republic and Esquire and elsewhere. And I think that in the case of Paul, I think that Paul, just a numbers guy who really understands economics, was just appalled, and rightly so, as he, in the earliest days of the Bush administration, just saw that, as he said, it had fuzzy math and the numbers just didn't add up, and I think it offended his professionalism as an economist. I don't think there was anything particularly ideological about it. In my case, it's almost a parallel thing. I think that in my case, it wasn't the numbers that caught my eye, but the stagecraft.
I was going to say, yeah.
The fact that, why are they always putting on a show? Why does everything have a backdrop with, Orwellian words telling you what to think? Basically, what are they hiding? What is this sort of Wizard of Oz-like theater that they've set up? And I think that's what got me going about the Bush administration. Maybe all the time I spent reviewing theater and thinking about the theater, including Washington theater, I know empty spectacle when I see it. If I know nothing else, I know that. And at a certain point, not to make light of something that's been tragic for many Americans and the world, this whole spectacle that they put on is, like a big empty Andrew Lloyd Webber contraption. There are chandeliers rising and falling. There are people landing in planes and aircraft carriers and celebrating victory, and it's empty inside.
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing I can imagine you must have wished was that you could have the same power as a critic of the administration that you were said to have as a critic of Broadway.
Yeah, this is not a show that could be closed out of town, I'll tell you. It's had quite a run.
Could you write, 2 columns a week?
No, I write one double-length column.
That's it. It's one double length.
Right.
So
it's sort of unique for the page. At one point, I did write 2 short columns a week in the 90s, and I just didn't enjoy the form. I wanted to write something more like an essay, and they created this for me.
In other words, what I was getting to was you've written a lot of this, a lot about the administration, so on, but I'm guessing, again, linking this to your time as a theater critic, that why this book would be my next question, and is it really because you began to see that the narrative of the narrative, in a way, that the story of this administration that grabbed you was the fact that it was such a story?
That is exactly right, Terrence. And in fact, to take it even a step further, I started talking about this book a year and a half or so ago, or with my editor at Penguin, and because of my strong belief in a narrative and wanting to tell this story as a narrative as opposed to throwing together just, collecting columns or something like that, I felt it had to have a third act curtain. I felt it. I'm just such a, I guess, creature of the theater and a creature of narrative and the story that I felt I couldn't sit down and start writing this book unless I knew, in at least some figurative sense, when it was ending. So one place to look for an ending was in the 2004 election, and I sort of made an informal agreement with my editor that if Kerry won, well, that's the end of the story. But as we know, that did not happen. And when I started to write this book, when I decided I could write the book anyway was Katrina, a little over a year ago, because I realized this really was the third act curtain, that disaster and the Bush administration's response to it stripped bare everything that had been true about the administration all along, but here you had it all in one place, happening 24/7 in real time on television, with all the network anchors watching. The use of spin, the claiming of triumphs and successes that hadn't happened, the slowness to react to a city under siege, looting, just as in Baghdad after the invasion of Iraq. Everything was sort of played out in fast motion domestically. And I rolled the dice and said, this is the end of the story. This is the end of my book. He can't come back from it, and basically he hasn't, and that's when I started to write.
You felt with Katrina, tragic as it was, that it might be the end of this story, and you could now write the book with a third act. You also had an article recently, and I'm going to misquote you because I didn't find it exactly, but the one in which you said, the Iraq War is over, someone tell the president. Is that close?
Yes. I actually wrote that quite some time ago, and go ahead, I can explain what I meant.
And then I wonder, as I see that, are events going to make you as guilty as they were of mission accomplished?
I'm not declaring something quite as definitive as they did. I do feel that, we never know what's going to happen in the future, obviously, and there are many things that could scramble the situation in Iraq at home, events that we don't know about that have nothing to do with politicians, such as, God forbid, another domestic terrorism attack or who knows what. But I do feel, I have felt about the Iraq War for some time, that all we're talking about is the negotiation of how we draw down. The war is not going to end, sadly. The war is going to go on for a very, very long time. But American engagement at this level is, as the Vice President said over a year ago, in its last throes, by which I mean there's almost uniform agreement everywhere except in the White House that we have to start drawing down and figuring out the terms under which we're going to turn this over to Iraqis and one way or another get out. We're not going to get out all at once. No one really is advocating that in either political party in Washington. But, we now have conservative Republicans, including including, columnists like George Wolfe saying it's untenable, or in Los Angeles, Max Boot, a conservative writer for the Los Angeles Times, likening the war to Vietnam and saying either we've got to throw in a bunch of more troops or get it back to 50,000 troops. Well, I don't think we have the more troops to put in there.
Right.
And so we're just really talking about the terms of what is going to be some kind of slow fade.
So that's what you meant, kind of, was not the actual end, but the tipping point when...
The tipping point to American involvement.
Yeah.
That's all I meant. And when I said, tell it to the president, no kidding, because this is a guy who keeps saying, we have a plan for victory, we will stay the course, and there's no plan.
Right.
And so other people are going to make the plan for him, and depending, quite honestly, on what happens in the election this November, those plans may proceed quite quickly if one of the houses changes hands and this guy is a lame duck.
Right, and I've heard, and I don't know. Well, never mind. I don't want to get taken over by events, but I think you're right that once even one house shifts, then the conversation will shift. And my guess is partly the conversation will shift because of one of the things that seems to me is at the core of why they've been able to sell this so easily, which is that suddenly the media will not kiss up as much, and the media will not do anything for access to that administration the way they have.
Right. Well, I think already we've seen that shift. I mean, one point I make in my book is that for the longest time, and many people notice this, that if you had to watch Jon Stewart to see the administration get caught in a lie, like Dick Cheney would go on a network talk show and say, I never said that there was a pretty well confirmed connection between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and Jon Stewart would show you the Meet the Press clip where he said it and put them next to each other. Now, and really again, starting with Katrina, everyone, the media had to get with the program of actually being news people again, because you had, whether it be the infamous Brownie or, for that matter, Michael Chertoff saying, what's going on in the Superdome in New Orleans? We've heard nothing about that, and you see in split screen exactly what's going on. So they've sort of brought on themselves finally a media that's not as compliant as it was in the months and even years after 9/11.
Mm-hmm. One thing I noticed in reading the book was that, let's describe. I'll let you describe it. I'll give a little quick idea, but then I'll let you describe it. It seems to me that what it is it is a almost daily description of the development and the execution of this propaganda machine. Basically, there's a little bit prior to 9/11, but not a lot, from 9/11 through Katrina. And what I was going to say is, in reading it, I found myself remembering events that had happened, that had shocked me or infuriated me at the time, that I'd almost forgotten. For instance, Enron.
Right.
Which at the time was so huge and so tied to them. Abramoff, at the time, so big and so tied to them, and somehow it gets swamped by, I think, our ridiculous focus on Iraq.
Well, I think that, you describe correctly certainly what I'm trying to do in the book. I was trying to write a very lean, almost screenplay-like narrative of the past 4 or 5 years, but told almost entirely through their PR stunts and presentations, and how they presented it, and then what was behind the curtain, that renders it false. So, for instance, the first half of the book ends with the actual official war in Iraq, the 43 days between the day we invaded Iraq and the day that Bush went on the aircraft carrier outside of San Diego and said that the major combat operations had ended, the mission accomplished. Mm-hmm. And I realized that this war, while there were embedded reporters and we were getting all this coverage, was essentially a series of discrete shows that were put on for the American public that were actually fairly meaningless in terms of what was actually going on in the war, and which all served the purpose of sort of keeping casualties, our own and civilian casualties of Iraqis, off screen. So that if you look back on it, what happened those 43 days? First, we had shock and awe, this strange beginning, which was very telegenic and which people, were riveted by on television. But as someone later said, we were watching these, munitions and bombs go off in a city of 6 million people, 6 or so million people, but we had no sense of what they were hitting or who, if anyone was being killed. It was just like watching the Sun and Lumiere display. Then we started to take some casualties. There was a little bit of naysaying about the conduct of the invasion, and suddenly we had this drama about the rescue of Jessica Lynch, which is, we would later find out, was at variance with the facts, as Jessica Lynch herself knew them, although she was out of it, obviously, at the time.
Yeah, so thus she was perfectly cast.
She was perfectly cast, and
she couldn't even say, wait, this isn't what's happening.
Exactly, and they manufactured this Rambo-like scenario for her and this dramatic rescue, which was just not true. She was a brave young woman who suffered a grievous injury and was captured, but this sort of Audie Murphy drama was turned into by the Pentagon had nothing to do with reality. Then what happened next was the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue in Baghdad. It was one of many such statues in Baghdad of Saddam, and as some people pointed out at the time, it too was a contrived event done with the help of the Americans, and while television commentators following the lead of Rumsfeld and others kept referring to it as a moment in history tantamount to the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. The Berliners tore down their wall. The Americans didn't. It was a completely different event, again, somewhat staged. And then finally, we get to Mission Accomplished, which is like this big MGM musical first act finale, celebrating the end of combat operations when, as we well know, sadly, they weren't ending. And so that's sort of the pattern of the whole book. I've looked at everything they've done as they presented it, and then tried to puncture the balloons and show what was inside it where appropriate.
Right, and in fact, there's a section of the book from actually quite a long section, almost 80 pages, from 229 to 305, which is no longer narrative but is the timeline.
Right. This is the appendix to the book, and this started during the early days of the Valerie Plame, Joseph Wilson, leak case. I started to notice, largely because, not so much because of the case itself, but just the reporting that started to emerge then about what went on with weapons of mass destruction and the evidence about WMDs that was presented to the public, including, through the press, including somewhat notoriously through the New York Times, in the run-up to the war. We started to learn for the first time in detail around that case that there was a discrepancy between what they had been saying in the run-up to the war and what they actually knew and when they knew it. And I started then just keeping, as a guy, it's almost a Cliff Notes or an aid to myself, in writing the column, a list where a calendar where I just say, well, they said on X date, January 2003, that there was uranium, that Saddam had uranium from Africa, and then I would find out, but wait a minute, Joe Wilson had reported earlier that wasn't true, or someone else had. And I just started putting these discrepancies, and I kept working on this right up through writing the book.
Right, so other things
80
like
pages now.
Right, so who could have imagined this scenario by Condi Rice, and then we go back years, and we see, they were reported this was a possible scenario. So it's all that kind of thing of putting this is what they said on this date, this is what they knew months and years before. Exactly.
It becomes almost like a game. It's in two columns because you see them side by side, and you go back between them, and it's rather eye-opening. And all it is their own words and published information collated that we would learn later on that shows that they were telling us things that they knew to be false.
Let me ask you, one, you referred to it slightly there, but if you can give sort of a brief answer to this one, the role of the New York Times as being manipulated and used, and I'm going to tell you one everyone knows about is Judith Miller. The other one that strikes me is just as you and Krugman's and Herbert's and Dowd's op-eds were flying around the web and inflaming everyone, the New York Times decided they would charge for those.
right, there are two separate issues. I can give you answers to both of them.
Yeah.
One of them has nothing to do with politics. So let's start with the one that let's start with Judy Miller. Right?
Yeah.
Judy Miller situation I talk about in the book. Essentially, for whatever reasons, Judy ran pieces that we now know, ran articles that the Times published in the run-up to the war that were overly credulous about WMD claims, and that often backed up, intentionally or not, the administration scenario that was being cooked up that would take us into war against this grave threat of Saddam Hussein.
Right. One could almost, Frank, put it another one of those column next to column, which was, this is what the administration's talking points, this is Judith Miller's columns.
Well, I talk about that in the book, and indeed in the timeline, too. I have, some excerpts from Miller's activities when they relate to the main narrative, which they do. She was not alone in doing this. Many others did, too, and there were also good reporters at the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere, particularly the Knight Ridder chain, that did have accurate stories about.
And we're questioning her reports. Yeah.
Yeah, we're questioning the administration line. I don't think it was necessarily questioning her reporting back then, but those stories were often buried, and it was a huge failure of the media, in which, of course, the Times was complicit. It is, however, a separate issue from her involvement with the plane case, which is much more complicated and where I'm not so sure that she did anything wrong. The wires crossed, and in fact, she went to jail for a worthy principle. In the case of the Times charging for op-ed columnists, indeed for all columnists, that was a business decision made by the business side of the Times, and all I can say is I understand the philosophy of it. The Times can't pay for all its news gathering. It can't have great people like John Burns and Dexter Filkins risking their lives to report on the Iraq War if the Times can't make money. So
I know. It's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the timing is so frustrating.
A lot of people are annoyed about it. I can assure you I don't get a dime from it, and regret losing the readers that can't read me anymore.
Let me ask this question, which is that you've put this book out. Obviously, the timing is a couple of months ahead of the November elections. Right. It really is going to remind people, look, this is what they've been doing. This is how, in case you've gotten foggy about it, here's just how much they were lying. Here's just how much they were manipulating you. Are you hopeful at this moment? In other words, when we started at the top of the show and you said, you feel like they can't get their credibility back, etc., I have to say, with them, I feel like it's almost like watching Jason or, those monsters from the B movies that come back and come back and come back. I call them electoral savants, that they are only good at demonizing their enemies and winning elections and have no inclination or competence for governing. But they seem incredibly good at the other, and I'm up until November 7th, I will be afraid that they're going to pull this off again.
Look, anything can happen. It's foolhardy to predict a national election like this, where, after all, hundreds of individual local elections where most people are not voting with some big picture in mind. That said, and I don't know what's going to happen, and it's possible, I guess anything's possible. I've learned not to predict elections. That said, this is, we have a country now where 60% of the country is against the war that the government is fighting in Iraq, where 70% of the country feels that the country is on the wrong track.
Yeah, that's an amazing number.
It's an amazing number. People are discontent for a lot of reasons. Iraq is very high on the list. So are certain issues about the economy, particularly about inequality of gain for the middle class in terms of tax cuts and everything else. So I think these things eventually do have consequences. I think that the Bush propaganda machine, and I talk about this is a big point in my book, have been enabled by two things. One is the media environment, whether it be the credulousness of newspapers like the Times in the run-up to the war about Iraq, or the sort of obsequiousness on the part of a lot of television network news, which is still the main way that most Americans get their news, to the press's self-inflicted errors like ours, like CBS's. All of that has helped them. So has a not very interesting or brave Democratic Party.
Exactly.
With a rather lousy bench of leaders, including potential presidents and the rest of it. One reason why I feel the tide was changing and felt it even before the 2004 election, before I started to write this book, is that an incredibly ineffectual candidate, in my view, clumsy. He's not a warm presence,
right.
and his views about the war were incoherent. Even so, he only lost by 3.5 million votes.
Right.
And I think that shows just if the Democratic Party had its act together, they could have probably done better than they did in 2000, where they won, when, as we know, they won the popular vote. It didn't happen and largely because you can't fight something with nothing.
Right.
Democrats have to start fighting something with something. It doesn't mean doctrinaire positions of any kind, but it means leadership and sticking their necks out there and taking stands. I think we're beginning to see some of that.
Okay, we got to wrap it up. Let me tell people, the book is The Greatest Story Ever Sold, The Decline and Fall of Truth from 9/11 to Katrina. Frank Rich will be appearing at the LA Central Public Library the night of October 8th, and you can learn more at www.lapl.org. Thank you, Frank Rich. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.